Opening up diagonals for your queen and king's bishop immediately contests the center. Meeting the king's pawn advance head-on establishes a balanced central struggle, immediately contesting key squares and preparing for pawn breakthroughs. Developing a knight towards the center immediately challenges black's pawn and prepares castling, seizing the initiative. Developing the knight here logically protects the e5 pawn and prepares for castling, establishing a solid central presence. Instantly establishing a menacing diagonal points towards kingside action, potentially disrupting black's harmonious setup, challenging the bishop's presence. This knight's advance ignites central pawn struggles and opens lines for future piece deployment. Securing the king's safety first allows white to focus on developing pieces and controlling the center with a clear mind. Boldly snatching the pawn, black initiates a sharp tactical skirmish, immediately challenging white's central pawn structure and aiming to disrupt white's developing harmony with a gambit. Unleashing central pressure, white boldly stakes a claim, aiming to disrupt black's harmony and seize the initiative. The knight's retreat now frees the d-pawn, potentially contesting the center and preparing for piece development. Bending the pawn structure, white now aims to exploit the doubled pawns by forcing a favorable exchange, potentially creating weaknesses on the queenside for black. Capturing the bishop on c6 with the pawn is a bold step, fundamentally altering the pawn structure and opening the d-file for your queen. While it doubles your pawns, it also grants you a powerful central presence and potentially weakens white's kingside control in the long run. This creates an unbalanced position where both sides must navigate their unique advantages and disadvantages carefully. Opening up a central pathway now, white's pawn boldly occupies the crucial e5 square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit potential weaknesses around the king. The knight hops back to a more central square, eyeing the d4 pawn and potentially preparing to support a kingside advance, while also creating a temporary pawn structure imbalance that might invite further tactical exploration. Sacrificing the queen now, a bold decision to transition into an endgame, aims to disrupt black's knight development and expose their king's safety. Centralizing the king into the heart of the board now creates a fortress against any immediate queen checks, while simultaneously opening up vital lines for the remaining pieces. Developing the knight to c3 swiftly asserts control over central squares, preparing for pawn advances or further piece deployment and aiming to restrict black's already somewhat cramped position. Relocating the monarch to a more secure central square, away from the open d-file, seems like a prudent reaction to white's knight activity. However, this places the king on a diagonal still exposed to potential future checks from the white bishop. If it were to reposition effectively, reclaiming the central file becomes a priority as white reroutes a rook, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially apply pressure against black's now somewhat exposed king, which has lost its castling rights and is a lingering concern. Recapturing the pawn and developing the knight to a more active square creates some attacking potential for black. Observe how the knight on e7 now supports a future d-pawn push and offers a potential outpost on c6. If the situation allows, recapturing the knight towards the center solidifies white's central presence and prepares for an eventual knight outpost on d4, creating a significant positional squeeze. Pouncing the knight to g6 aims to reclaim lost time and solidify black's somewhat scattered pawn structure, but it risks inviting white's other knight to a more active central square, potentially amplifying black's piece activity deficit in the ensuing middle game skirmishes. Unlocking the kingside, this maneuver aims to reorient the knight, potentially eyeing the vulnerable squares around black's monarch, while simultaneously improving piece harmony by connecting the rooks and preparing for a central pawn push, solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing for a more active role by unpinning the knight, and opening a diagonal for the queen's bishop is a sensible reaction to white's aggressive piece play. Repositioning the rook to the open file offers greater flexibility for an eventual central pawn push or a supporting role in controlling the d4 square. Black boldly advances the c-pawn, challenging white's central pawn structure and aiming to gain breathing room for the bishop on g7. This pawn push immediately creates a tension that white must address, potentially forcing a recapture or a subtle repositioning. It's a fight for space on the queenside and a test of white's ability to maintain their positional advantages against black's dynamic counterplay. The knight repositioning to b3 aims to bolster the d4 pawn and potentially eye weaknesses on the queenside, a subtle yet persistent pressure. Unlocking the queenside's potential, this pawn advances to create space and prepare for potential piece maneuvering, aiming to challenge white's central control and establish a more harmonious setup for black's pieces. Unleashing a fork that tears apart black's pawn structure and threatens the king creates immediate tactical chaos, forcing concessions. A strategic retreat, the black king seeks refuge on its native square, aiming to stabilize its position amidst the exposed central pawns and prepare for a potential recapture of the e5 pawn by its knight, while acknowledging white's strong central control and the open nature of the d-file that white's rook now dominates. Seizing the central outpost, the knight orchestrates a positional squeeze, aiming to disrupt black's nascent queenside development and prepare for a forceful invasion. Finally, black develops a piece to a somewhat useful square, seeking to connect the remaining pieces and perhaps prepare for a central pawn push, a necessary step to alleviate the cramped nature of their position. Redirecting knight pressure to the queenside, aiming to support the pawn advance and potentially develop queenside initiative. Opening the diagonal for the bishop, black immediately attempts to counter white's space advantage and free up the queen's defense, though it does create a pawn weakness on d6. Tightening the grip on the center, this knight repositioning aims to solidify the pawn chain and prepare for eventual advances on the queenside, while simultaneously restricting black's king's limited mobility. Embracing the center, the knight boldly occupies the pawn's former territory, aiming to disrupt white's nascent control and seize initiative in the still fluid central area. Asserting control over the center with the knight redirects white's focus towards black's potentially exposed queenside pawn structure, aiming to exploit the doubled c-pawns and the isolated d-pawn. The knight scurries back, seeking safety and a better outpost. But this retreat opens a critical diagonal for white's bishop, potentially targeting black's vulnerable king. Re-establishing knights in their central outposts aims to solidify white's control over the critical d4 and e5 squares, preparing for a potential kingside pawn push or a more active knight maneuver. Relocating the bishop to c7 aims to solidify the pawn chain and prepare for potential pawn breaks, though it concedes some immediate central influence. Unlocking the c4 square for a centralized knight offers significant tactical and positional advantages, aiming to disrupt black's cramped position and potentially create attacking chances against the uncastled king. Exposing that vulnerable pawn chain with a pawn advance now seems to challenge white's central control, creating a potential outpost for your knight on e5, though it does weaken the dark squares around your own monarch. Sacrificing the knight opens a clear path for the rooks to dominate the central files, creating immediate pressure on black's isolated pawns and undeveloped pieces. Opening the H-file now exposes your king to potential threats along the newly liberated pathway. Creating an immediate strategic imbalance white will undoubtedly seek to exploit. Fortifying the king's immediate vicinity becomes paramount as white seeks to create a safe haven, preventing any potential skirmishes on the H-file that could threaten the monarch. The monarch's relocation, though seemingly passive, skillfully repositions the king to a slightly more secure square, away from the exposed D-file and potentially eyeing a future retreat via the G-file. While the centralized knight on E5 remains a thorny problem for black's cramped army. Developing the bishop to E3 solidifies white's control over the central squares and prepares for potential king-side operations, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed black king. Unleashing the G-pawn signals a bold attempt to disrupt white's burgeoning central control and create counterplay, a necessary gamble given the current positional imbalance. Steering the knight towards the kingside opens up avenues for pressure against black's somewhat exposed monarch, aiming to exploit the open files that might soon arise. Befriending the bishop on F5 offers a potential outpost and prepares for the bishop pair advantage, aiming to exploit the open diagonals that will inevitably emerge as the pawn structure shifts. Anchoring the pawn structure with the C3 advance solidifies white's central control and prepares for future pawn breaks, while also offering the knight a more secure square if needed. The rook swings to the open file, aiming to challenge white's control and perhaps open lines for its own pieces. Seeking to activate the knight by repositioning it to a more central and attacking square. This maneuver prepares to exert pressure on black's somewhat exposed kingside pawn structure. Asserting queenside presence, black anchors a bishop to the D8-H4 diagonal, anticipating future central pawn advances and reinforcing the underdeveloped queenside pieces. Solidifying control of the central squares becomes the priority as F3 shores up the E4 pawn and prepares to support further pawn advances or a potential knight repositioning. Navigating the nascent endgame requires careful repositioning. Bringing the king closer to the center aims to activate it for potential defensive duties or future attacking opportunities, though it must be done with extreme caution given the potential for discovered attacks. Stepping back, white repositions the bishop to a more accommodating diagonal, preparing to potentially support a kingside advance or simply find a better square to avoid further exchanges. Shifting the bishop to this diagonal immediately activates it, presenting a direct threat to white's kingside and aiming to disrupt the coordinated pawn structure that black has been carefully building. Pivoting the knight to E3 offers new attacking avenues by preparing to potentially slide it over to F5 or G4, threatening black's somewhat exposed king position. It also bolsters the central pawn structure and clears a path for potential pawn advances on the king side, aiming to exploit the awkward placement of black's bishop and knight. Reigniting central activity by bringing the rook into the fray. Preparing to challenge the open file. Probing for weaknesses on the queenside. White aims to create space and disrupt black's developing harmony. Repositioning the rook to the central file aims to activate its dormant potential and challenge white's dominion over the E-file, potentially setting up a future pawn break or defensive maneuver. Pivoting the knight to the F1 square is a subtle repositioning, aiming to bring fresh attacking potential towards the kingside. Seeking to disrupt white's queenside initiative and create an outpost for the bishop. This move repositions the piece to a square where it eyes potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure. Initiating the exchange of rooks now, before black solidifies their bishop's position on the long diagonal. aims to simplify the position and exploit white's active knight placement. Reclaiming the now vacant central square allows your rook to participate fully in the game again, re-establishing a vital diagonal threat. Opening the queenside flank now is a bold gambit, attempting to pry open lines and potentially trap black's powerful bishop on b3. However, it could also leave white's own king exposed if black can react precisely. Embracing the rook's power, black repositions to the second rank, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create mating threats by activating the king's attacker on the open file. Initiating pawn breaks on the flank often signals a shift towards opening lines and activating dormant pieces. Opening the A file with the pawn push initiates a critical race for control and potentially opens the door for your rook to become a powerful attacking force on the queenside, forcing white's pieces into a defensive posture or risk losing material. This maneuver skillfully leverages the open files, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the isolated doubled pawns. Reclaiming the open D file, the bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing weaknesses on the queenside or preparing to support an advance. The bishop repositions, seeking to improve its defensive stance and prepare for potential incursions on the kingside. Anticipating black's likely attempts to activate their rook on the open file, the bishop retreats to its starting square, seemingly regaining a comfortable position. But this retreat now allows white to dominate the A file, creating potent attacking possibilities against black's uncoordinated pieces. Reactivating the bishop's influence on the queenside offers a new dimension of pressure, potentially aiming to exploit the pinned pawn on c6 or create outposts. Reasserting the rook's presence on the open file aims to disrupt white's queenside expansion and potentially create counterplay against the lightly defended king. Gaining control of the kingside diagonals becomes paramount as the bishop repositions to eye black's exposed pieces. Black's bishop now eyes the queenside majority and reinforces the pawn on circa 5, aiming to unlock counterplay. Slipping the rook onto the 8th rank creates immediate pressure along that vital horizontal, potentially trapping the black king or forcing concessions if the bishop on c4 is moved. A strategic concession. The bishop retreating to e7 appears to acknowledge white's initiative on the A file, potentially preparing to contest it or at least to avoid being trapped there. The rook repositions, seeking to infiltrate the queenside and exploit the open files that may soon materialize. Unleashing a pawn storm towards the white king is a daring gambit. Now the question is whether the unleashed energy can break through the defensive structure before the king itself becomes a target. Securing the E file and preparing to contest its control is the immediate goal, opening avenues for the rook to become active while potentially preventing black from solidifying their central pawn structure. The rook's relocation to the newly opened file offers a vital connection, poised to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the king. The pawn structure is irrevocably altered. White now initiates a deliberate dismantling of black's remaining pawn chain. Navigating the board with this bishop offers a fresh perspective, aiming to disrupt white's seemingly organized pawns by introducing potential weaknesses or creating tactical opportunities on the queenside. Activating the bishop to challenge black's advanced pawn and prepare for potential exchanges on the kingside. Coordinating the bishops to eye open diagonals presents a subtle threat, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawns and potentially infiltrate the enemy camp. Solidifying the bishop's influence. This placement prepares to contest the open files and potentially disrupt black's developing pawn. structure by offering a trade that simplifies white's position. The king ventures out, seeking a more active role, but must be wary of the lurking enemy bishop on the long diagonal and the potential for white's rooks to become active. The knight repositions, seeking better squares and aiming to outflank the bishop's influence while preparing to contest the central squares. The bishop's retreat to g3 surprisingly shores up the dark squares surrounding the white king, a subtle defense against potential infiltration, while simultaneously preparing to reposition itself to a more active diagonal later on. Reinforcing the knight on e3 feels like a hesitant regrouping, perhaps eyeing the d3 bishop while acknowledging the loss of the a-pawn's defensive shield and the lingering pressure on white's kingside after black's last bishop maneuver. Re-establishing the bishop to its more active square hints at a potential desire to provoke weaknesses on the kingside or to create more dynamic pawn play, even if it means temporarily conceding the center. Refocusing the knight towards its original square, signaling a potential repositioning to support a central advance or shore up the kingside defense as the queenside pawn structure stabilizes. Unlocking the c-file with this pawn push creates a fascinating structural confrontation. Now, white's pieces must navigate a newly divided board, and black has a chance to activate their rooks on open or semi-open lines. Pushing the g-pawn to g4 is a bold attempt to shatter black's pawn shield and pry open lines for white's pieces, but it risks creating a permanent weakness on the kingside. Unlocking the c-file, black aims to activate their remaining pieces and challenge white's central pawn structure, creating a dynamic imbalance in the pawn play. Seizing the open file with the pawn sacrifice reshapes the central structure and promises an aggressive pawn storm. The king ventures out from its shell, a bold maneuver seeking to activate its presence in the center of the board amidst the pawn jungle. Piloting the king towards the action, aiming to support the pawn push and potentially create an outpost for the knight, feels like a proactive step in this intricate maneuvering game. Embracing the outpost, the bishop boldly advances to f4, eyeing the weakened dark squares around white's king and preparing to potentially disrupt the nascent pawn chain on the kingside. Exchanging these bishops immediately simplifies the material situation, creating an endgame where white's knight, despite its slightly awkward placement, can begin to dominate the center as black's pawns are now less defended. The king boldly steps out, initiating a risky but necessary march towards the center, aiming to become an active participant in the unfolding endgame rather than a passive target for potential attacks. Opening the queenside flank with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create an outpost for the knight, but it also concedes a central foothold. Harnessing the newly opened queenside expanse, black seeks to create active counterplay and potentially secure a passed pawn by advancing the b-pawn.